August 4th, 1943. The southern face of the Kursk salient glowed in the faint light of dawn, its horizon smeared with drifting smoke and the bruised remnants of night. The air tasted of burnt grain, diesel vapors, and the metallic tang of ruptured earth. A silence hovered for a moment over the fields near the village of Bolshoi Mayachki, a rare, fragile quiet that seemed unnatural for a landscape that had been torn open for weeks by the grinding collision of two armies. Under that dim sky, a single man moved through the trenches of the Soviet Fifth Guards Army, stepping over spent shells and torn canvas, his boots sinking into the soft, crater-broken soil. Major Ivan Andreevich Kurolkov, 41 years old, formerly a schoolteacher in Tambov and now the operations officer of the 9th Guards Rifle Division, paused and lifted his field binoculars toward the western ridge. There, barely outlined in the fading darkness, he saw the silhouettes that would shape the next 12 hours and perhaps the fate of the entire southern sector. The jagged shadow of a German armored column stretched across the ridge, long, heavy, and unmistakably vast. He could see the low, hulking shapes of Panzer IVs, the angular outlines of Stug 3 assault guns, and the taller, imposing silhouettes of Tiger tanks whose thick armor gleamed like dull iron beneath the rising sun. Behind them, trucks, half-tracks, motorcycle detachments, and artillery tractors formed a seemingly endless procession of steel. It looked less like a column and more like a moving wall. Kurolkov lowered the binoculars slowly, his breath steady though his pulse hammered. The previous night had carried rumors through the trenches. The Germans were preparing a renewed push, a final attempt to pierce the Soviet lines after the failure of their offensive at Prokhorovka 3 weeks earlier. Field Marshal von Manstein had insisted the southern pincer could still break through. General Haupt's 4th Panzer Army was regrouping. XLVI Panzer Corps had been reinforced. And now, standing on the lip of a ravine littered with broken Soviet helmets and twisted shrapnel, Kurolkov saw the truth of those whispers take form in front of him. This was not a probing attack. This was not a reconnaissance thrust. This was a concentrated armored strike, the largest the Germans had assembled in the sector since mid-July. The men around him knew what that meant even before he spoke. The 9th Guards Rifle Division had been battered relentlessly since the opening days of Operation Citadel. They had dug new trenches in ground still warm from artillery fire. They had carried wounded comrades across fields where machine gun belts lay scattered like dead snakes. They had buried officers in shallow graves marked with broken rifle stocks. Yet now, faced with a force of armor that seemed to eclipse the very landscape, they tightened their grips on their rifles and adjusted the straps of their ammunition pouches with a sort of resigned clarity. They understood that the line must hold here, on this ridge, against an enemy whose steel outweighed their own 10-1. Kurolkov scanned the defensive positions once more. The trenches cut across the earth in a jagged pattern, reinforced with wooden planks scavenged from barns and shattered supply wagons. Behind them, a line of anti-tank guns, his 376mm field pieces, stood camouflaged under branches and tarp. Their crews, gaunt and soot-smudged, crouched beside them like statues of iron and fatigue. The soil beneath the guns was dark and moist from recent rain, making the recoil trenches collapse inward, but the gunners had already dug them out repeatedly through the night. Farther back, in a thin copse of birch trees, the division's lone battery of 122mm howitzers waited with barrels elevated, their gun crews whispering final calculations under their breath. To the north, minefields, laid hastily 3 days earlier, lay hidden beneath a deceptive blanket of tall grass. To the south, a ravine served as both lifeline and trap, offering the only cover but also the most predictable target for German artillery. The division had barely 60% of its original strength. Its anti-tank rifles were outdated. Its ammunition reserves were low. And its commander, Colonel Dmitry Stepanovich Gorshkov, had been killed 2 nights earlier during an air raid that flattened the divisional command post. Yet in the chaos of the front, the division remained in place. It had not broken. It had not withdrawn. The story of how a single Soviet division stopped the largest German armored push in the southern sector of the Kursk battle cannot be understood without returning to the roots of the operation that birthed this clash. The soil around Bolshoi Mayatsky was not simply ground on which soldiers fought. It was the final convergence point of years of strategic failures, doctrinal miscalculations, and the fading echoes of German momentum that had once seemed unstoppable. To understand why the German commanders were stunned on that early August morning, one must understand what they expected to happen and why they believed the Soviet line would collapse under the weight of their assault. Operation Citadel, launched on July 5, 1943, was the Wehrmacht's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. Instead of sweeping advances and rapid penetration as in 1941, it opened with grinding attrition against the deepest defensive system the Soviets had ever built. The Germans imagined the Kursk salient as a bulge of vulnerable territory begging to be sliced off, its central protrusion an exposed outgrowth. In reality, the salient had been turned into a fortress. Soviet engineers, labor battalions, and entire populations, men, women, and children, had reshaped the landscape into a labyrinth of trenches, fire sacks, anti-tank zones, dugouts, communication tunnels, minefields, and artillery strongpoints layered across hundreds of kilometers. The Red Army had spent months preparing for the attack. The Germans knew the defenses were strong, but never fully grasped their density. In the southern sector, the German plan relied on XLVI Panzer Corps and 2 SS Panzer Corps penetrating through the Voronezh front, breaking open the Soviet positions and driving northward to meet the Ninth Army, pushing from the north. The plan would have encircled multiple Soviet armies, restoring the initiative that Germany had lost after Stalingrad. But Citadel had been delayed repeatedly. Hitler had waited for new tanks, the Panther, the Tiger, the Ferdinand, hoping they would offset Soviet defensive strength. The delay proved fatal. Every week bought the Germans more armor, but gave the Soviets more time to dig. By late July, the offensive stalled. The SS divisions fought brutal engagements near Prokhorovka. Panthers broke down in alarming numbers. German infantry suffered from attrition rates they could no longer replace. The Soviets counterattacked on the Ural sector. The strategic balance shifted sharply. Yet despite growing uncertainty, von Manstein remained convinced the southern pincer still had potential. He believed a final, concentrated armored effort could still punch through weakened Soviet lines to the east of Belgorod. He saw opportunity in the exhaustion of Soviet units that had fought nonstop for a month. He saw the chance to deliver a blow that would prevent the Red Army from assuming the offensive that High Command feared was imminent. This optimism filtered down through headquarters reports, operations briefings, and the personal confidence of senior field commanders. The Germans genuinely believed their armored forces, even reduced by weeks of fighting, still possessed the concentrated strength to break a Soviet division already showing signs of collapse. A common belief throughout German command was that Soviet infantry divisions, once battered by sustained frontline pressure, would reach a tipping point beyond which their combat capacity would falter irreversibly. They had seen it happen many times in 1941 and 1942. Divisions shattered, regiments dissolved, battalions melted into the forests. And when the infantry broke, no line, no matter how fortified, could be held. But the 9th Guards Rifle Division was not an ordinary infantry unit. Its ranks were filled with survivors of Stalingrad, former factory workers from Omsk, veterans of defensive operations along the Don, and young replacements who had marched hundreds of kilometers to reinforce the front. Their officers understood the stakes at Kursk with a clarity shared across the Red Army by that stage of the war. If Kursk held, The Germans would never again seize the strategic initiative. If Kursk fell, the path to Moscow would be threatened once more. There was no room for collapse, no ground to retreat to. The line was not simply a geographical marker, but a conceptual threshold between victory and another year of devastation. The logistical reality of the battlefield further intensified the situation. Behind the 9th Guards Division stretched the arteries feeding the Soviet counteroffensive aimed toward Kharkov. Ammunition trains rattled down the rails, carrying crates of 76mm shells for the tank corps assembling near Belgorod. Engineers transported bridging equipment for planned river crossings. Fuel convoys moved under cover of night, their drums of gasoline destined for T-34 battalions preparing for an armored thrust that High Command intended to launch before the Germans could reorganize. Everything depended on the line holding. A breakthrough here would not simply cost territory. It would unravel a broader plan designed to expel the Germans from the region entirely. For the Germans, the southern face of the salient represented their last chance to correct the failure unfolding across the front. The Luftwaffe had been severely attrited, struggling with shortages of aviation fuel and worn engines. Ground divisions were under strength. Infantry replacements were scarce. Even the elite panzer divisions had been drained by continuous combat. Yet German Field Command still saw the possibility of a decisive tactical success. Their armored forces, though diminished, retained superior coordination, better tactical radios, and formidable long-range gunnery. The Tiger's 88mm guns could destroy a T-34 long before the Soviet tank could close to an effective range. Panzer IVs with the KWK 40L/48 cannons had proven lethal in defensive engagements. German combined arms doctrine, carefully orchestrated cooperation between infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers, remained among the most refined in the world. But what German commanders misunderstood, what they had miscalculated repeatedly since the turning tide of 1942, was the depth of Soviet resilience. They underestimated not just the material reinforcements arriving from Ural factories, but the psychological and experiential transformation of the Red Army. The force they faced at Kursk was no longer the same army that reeled in chaos during the summer of 1941. It was now a hardened, disciplined, strategically conscious machine forged through the crucible of Stalingrad and tempered in a million smaller battles. The command structure had improved. Artillery coordination was tighter. Defensive doctrine had evolved. Field units could improvise rapidly under pressure. And above all, the soldiers in the trenches understood the existential nature of their fight. By the time the Germans prepared their renewed assault in early August, the Soviet leadership had already anticipated the likelihood of further armored pushes. Detailed reconnaissance had mapped German staging areas. Field intelligence had reported the movement of Tiger tanks south of Belgorod. Radio intercept from German units had hinted at preparations for another attempt to breach the weakened forward line. The Soviet divisional staffs had worked through the nights, drawing new firing plans for their artillery and adjusting the placement of anti-tank guns. They knew the Germans would try again. They simply did not know exactly when. The 9th Guards Rifle Division had been rotated between sectors multiple times during the battle, each time absorbing casualties, losing experienced officers, and fighting in conditions that shredded units with terrifying speed. Yet the division maintained its cohesion. Its regiments retained their core cadres. Its officers understood that their purpose was not to achieve dramatic victories, but to prevent German breakthroughs long enough for armored reserves to reach the sector. They were not expected to advance. They were expected to hold. The German commanders failed to comprehend the significance of this. They believed the division to be exhausted beyond effective resistance. They believed its anti-tank defenses were thin, its ammunition depleted, its morale fraying. They believed they could break it with a concentrated armored thrust. And so, As dawn broke on August 4th and the columns of tanks began descending toward Bolshoi-Mayatsky, the German generals viewed the engagement not as a gamble, but as an opportunity, a final, forceful strike against a cracking enemy line. Yet the Soviets had constructed multiple fallback trenches behind the forward ridge. They had camouflaged anti-tank positions in earthen mounds that looked like remnants of shell craters. They had hidden entire rifle companies in abandoned farmhouses from which firing slits had been carved into crumbling walls. They had prepared the ground with mines, dug artillery spotter posts into ravines, and placed 45mm anti-tank guns in positions that German tanks would only see once they had already driven past them. The battlefield had been sculpted into a killing ground, and though the division was depleted, it retained enough fight to turn that carefully prepared terrain into a barrier heavy armor could not cross easily. In the hours leading up to the attack, Soviet artillery officers pored over maps, noting every dip and contour of the terrain. They memorized ranges. They calculated likely approach vectors. They readied pre-sighted fire missions designed to catch the German armor as it attempted to spread out across the field. The artillerymen knew their guns could not destroy Tigers reliably, but they also knew how to damage tracks, rupture fuel lines, and force tanks into predetermined choke points where infantry equipped with anti-tank rifles, grenades, or satchel charges could finish the job. In the rear positions, medical officers sharpened bone saws and boiled water in enamel pots over field stoves, aware they would soon face a flood of wounded men whose fates rested on their hands. The Soviet command understood the stakes clearly. The southern sector hung in balance. The German armored push represented the final concentrated effort to tilt the battle back toward their favor. If the line broke, the Soviets would lose the hard-fought advantage gained over weeks of bloodshed. If it held, the German armored strength in this region would be irreparably weakened, their ability to maneuver constrained for the remainder of the month, and their prospects for any future offensive shattered. Thus the ridge at Bolshoi-Mayatsky became more than a defensive position. It became the fulcrum upon which the strategic vision of both armies rested. The Germans brought the weight of their doctrine and firepower. The Soviets brought the weight of survival and necessity. And when the Tigers finally began their long advance toward the Soviet lines, the German generals still believed the outcome was predetermined. They believed the Soviet division would yield. They did not yet understand that this division, scarred, tired, undersupplied, had already decided it would not. The German armored column advanced with a precision that seemed almost mechanical, as though the movement of steel across the landscape were dictated by an unseen engineer rather than human will. The rising sun cast long shadows behind the panzers, giving them the appearance of iron beasts marching with the confidence of previous victories. Dust trailed behind their tracks in beautiful but deceptive patterns, drifting like pale banners above the fields. The ground trembled under the continuous grind of engines, and with every meter they closed toward the Soviet line, the weight of inevitability grew heavier for both sides. The opening bombardment had prepared the way, or so German field officers believed. Artillery batteries had saturated the ridge with shells of various calibers, tearing apart forward trenches, smashing wooden supports, pulverizing parapets, and filling the air with soil and smoke that clung to the lungs like wet ash. The bombardment churned the earth into a broken crust through which infantry could barely move. Yet the Soviets were used to such transformations of the land. In the hours leading up to the dawn, the division had endured heavy fire, but the defenders clung to the deeper trenches and reinforced dugouts that had been built precisely for such moments. The first wave of destruction did not break the line. It merely set the stage. As the artillery lifted and the armor pushed forward, the Soviet positions entered the most perilous stage of their defense. The moment between the end of bombardment and the first shots of direct engagement always hung like a thin thread above disaster. Men emerged from protective shelters, jolted by concussive blasts, their hearing dulled, and the world around them ringing with a steady, unnatural hum. They moved slowly at first, feeling for their rifles, brushing dirt from ammunition boxes, reassembling machine guns that had been buried in soil minutes earlier. The air was still heavy with dust clouds that made silhouettes blur and depth vanish. It was in this suspended moment, between destruction and confrontation, that battlefield cohesion could easily collapse. The Germans counted on that collapse. But the cohesion held. The 9th Guards Rifle Division had fought too many desperate engagements to lose its sense of collective purpose because of a single artillery preparation. Officers and sergeants, their faces caked with dust, moved through the trenches with deliberate calm. They did not shout. They tapped shoulders, pointed to firing positions, nodded towards sectors of the field that needed reinforcement. Soldiers slid into place with a discipline born not of training manuals, but of lived experience. Every man understood what failure meant. Every man understood that his position was not simply a patch of earth, but a necessary stone in the wall holding back a tide. As the German tanks approached, the first exchange began at long range. The Panzers opened fire with high explosive rounds aimed at suspected anti-tank positions. Bright flashes burst across the ridge, sending soil spraying in arcing fountains. The shells detonated with sharp, cracking thunder that reverberated through the trench system. The Soviet anti-tank gunners, crouched behind their ZS-3s, waited. They could not waste ammunition on distant shots that would do little more than scuff armor. They needed the Panzers to come closer. They needed them within a zone where flank shots were feasible, where the vulnerable lower hull could be struck, where the narrow vision ports might be damaged, where tracks could be severed. The Germans advanced in layers, the Tigers at the center flanked by Panzer IVs and reconnaissance vehicles. The formation appeared flawless, as if crafted from doctrine rather than improvised in the field. Yet beneath the surface of this steel geometry lay a growing vulnerability. The terrain did not favor their approach. The field ahead of them, though seemingly open, was laced with uneven depressions left by previous bombardments, clumps of stubborn vegetation, and shallow stream beds hidden beneath thick summer grass. The German vehicles slowed unexpectedly at points, bunching together, where fields dictated narrower paths than the commanders desired. It was through these constraints that opportunity began to seed itself for the Soviet defenders. The first mine detonated under the right track of a Panzer IV at the leading edge of the column. The explosion lifted the tank slightly, slamming it back down as black smoke erupted from beneath its chassis. Its track flew off in twisted fragments, scattering across the field. The tank ground to a halt, immobilized. The smoke rose like a dark banner, signaling the true beginning of the engagement. The German advance hesitated as the column adjusted. Vehicles maneuvered around the disabled tank, engines revving, exhausts fuming. That momentary hesitation fed itself into the Soviet gunners' calculations. They fired. The first shots from the ZS. 3 guns streaked across the field with blunt violence. The 76mm shells cracked through the morning haze and slammed into the armor of the advancing Panzers. One shell struck the glassy plate of a Panzer IV, gouging a deep crater and setting fragments ricocheting inside the turret. The tank lurched but continued forward. Another shell struck the track of a second Panzer, snapping the metal chain and forcing it to pivot abruptly before coming to rest at an awkward angle. Soviet gun crews reloaded with mechanical efficiency, their motions drilled into muscle memory by months of battle. On the German side, awareness of Soviet resistance grew rapidly. What had been predicted as a weakened sector suddenly revealed an unexpectedly organized defense. German commanders inside their tanks adjusted their orders, fanning out to avoid choke points, calling for infantry support to flush out anti-tank teams, requesting artillery to suppress the ridge again. Yet the various elements of their combined arms force were operating in a space narrowed by terrain and complicated by mines, which disrupted their ability to maneuver with the flexibility their doctrine demanded. The Soviet infantry, hunkered in trenches and foxholes, watched the steel advance with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Machine gunners steadied their barrels on parapets. Riflemen fitted armor-piercing rounds into their Mosins. Anti-tank riflemen adjusted the aim of their cumbersome PTRD-41 weapons, knowing they could not destroy Tiger but might damage a Panzer IV's tracks or rear armor if given the chance. Across the line, soldiers waited for their moment, each instinctively understanding that the forward positions would absorb the first shock of the German strike, while the deeper trenches provided the fallback that would shape the later phases of the battle. The German infantry followed closely behind their armor, shielded by the metal tide rolling ahead of them. They moved in disciplined formations, rifles at the ready, prepared to engage Soviet defenders who survived the initial artillery blasts. As shells continued to fall on the ridge and the panzers pushed forward, German officers anticipated that the Soviet infantry would be forced to withdraw. But the withdrawal never came. The line held its form, battered but intact. Each crater became a firing point. Each mound of shattered soil became cover. The Soviets absorbed the punishment not because they were unafraid, but because they had been shaped by 2 years of relentless war into soldiers who understood that fear was simply another presence on the battlefield. It was there, but it did not move them. The Tigers advanced steadily, shrugging off glancing hits from Soviet guns. Their thick frontal armor withstood the pounding, and their 88mm cannons responded with devastating precision. The first Soviet anti-tank position was obliterated by a direct hit. The round struck with such force that the gun and its crew were flung backward in a cloud of splintered wood, torn canvas, and dark soil. The loss of the position created a gap in the defense, and the panzers moved toward it like predators sensing weakness. Yet the Soviet line did not crumble. Behind the destroyed gun, another position opened fire, exploiting the moment when the German tanks turned slightly to flank. Several shots ricocheted, but one struck a Panzer IV at the junction of its turret and hull. The penetration ignited ammunition stored inside, and flames poured from the hatch like a volcanic eruption. As the battle intensified, the landscape became a furnace of smoke, dust, and shattering steel. Mortar rounds whistled overhead. Artillery shells exploded in massive eruptions, throwing earth skyward in columns that resembled monstrous fountains of soil and rock. Machine guns barked in rhythmic patterns. The ground vibrated under the relentless movement of tracks and detonations, and the air thickened with a choking mixture of burning fuel and torn vegetation. It was no longer a structured engagement. It was a violent, chaotic struggle where survival hinged on seconds and instinct. The Soviets made use of every feature of the terrain. Infantrymen darted through communication trenches to reinforce threatened sectors. Runners carried messages when telephone wires were severed. Field engineers crawled beneath incoming fire to lay new mines in paths the panzers were beginning to exploit. In the ravine to the south, a platoon of Guards riflemen used the natural contours of the land to flank German infantry attempting to breach the line. They crept along the shaded ground, emerging at the precise moment when the German troops focused on suppressing a machine gun nest. Their sudden appearance forced a violent clash that prevented the Germans from establishing footholds in the trenches. Artillery observers, posted in concealed positions along the ridge, directed fire with extraordinary precision despite the disruption of bombardments. They measured the movement of the German armor, adjusting fire missions to target clusters of vehicles as they attempted to maneuver around the minefields. Soviet howitzers in the rear hammered the field with high-explosive shells that tore open the ground beneath the German advance. Each barrage did not necessarily destroy tanks, but it slowed their momentum, disoriented crews, and forced the formation to disperse in ways that weakened its ability to support the infantry following behind. The Germans grew increasingly aware that their assumptions had been wrong. This was not a fragmented division. This was not a compromised sector. The defenders showed no signs of unraveling. Their fire remained coordinated. Their anti-tank efforts showed discipline. Their infantry countered advances with stubborn tenacity. As the panzers pushed deeper toward the ridge, they found themselves not sweeping aside a weak defense, but becoming ensnared in a struggle that drained their advantages. For German commanders observing the field from their half-track command posts, the picture that emerged was not one of rapid penetration, but of incremental progress gained at too high a cost. Still, the German assault continued with determination. They brought forward Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, whose shrieking salvos turned sections of the ridge into plumes of fire and smoke. They tried to force breakthroughs by overwhelming the Soviet trenches with concentrated barges, but each attempt resulted in Soviet units pulling back a few meters, re-establishing firing lines, and continuing to resist. The depth of the Soviet defense now revealed itself. This was not a single trench line, but a layered system designed to absorb and deflect pressure. As the morning progressed, the German offensive became more strained. Tanks that had once moved with confidence now advanced cautiously, wary of hidden guns and mines. Infantry found themselves isolated in pockets of devastated terrain where communication was difficult and the ground offered little shelter. German engineers attempted to clear paths through minefields under fierce fire, dragging wounded comrades to cover while explosions erupted around them. Their bravery was evident, but so was the growing realization that the battlefield was not yielding to German doctrine. What German commanders could not fully perceive, but what the Soviet officers sensed acutely, was that the balance of the battle was shifting. The armor's initial momentum had been blunted. Key tanks were immobilized or destroyed. Their infantry was slowing. Their artillery could not maintain the suppression needed to keep the Soviets pinned down across such a wide front. The Soviet defensive system had absorbed the strike. It had bent but not broken, and now the conditions were emerging in which the defenders could exploit German vulnerabilities. By midday, the battlefield had ceased to resemble the plan drawn on German operations maps. Instead of a breakthrough corridor, there existed a maze of destroyed vehicles, smoking craters, and immobilized tanks that obstructed further progress. Each wreck became an obstacle for the vehicles behind it. Each crater forced detours that exposed hulls to new angles of fire. Each plume of smoke obscured visibility and disrupted coordination. In landscapes like these, strength could become weakness, and the panzers, for all their power, found themselves fighting against not just defenders, but the very terrain they sought to control. Yet the Soviets knew the battle was far from decided. They understood that the Germans would commit reserves, redirect armor, and attempt new angles of attack. But they also understood something deeper. The German command had expected collapse by now. They had expected the division to crack. They had expected the ridge to fall. The longer the line held, the more German confidence eroded. The more German losses mounted. The more the battlefield shifted in favor of the defenders. The conflict had entered its decisive middle stage. The momentum that powered the German push was faltering. The resilience that anchored the Soviet defense was hardening. And on that ridge, amid the smoke and shattered earth, the balance of the battle, slowly, painfully, inevitably began to tilt. A thin breeze whispered across the field, carrying with it the distant rumble of engines. The German column had begun to move in earnest, its armored vanguard descending the ridge in disciplined formation. Dust clouds rose behind them, glowing faintly gold in the early light. Kurolkov lifted his binoculars again and studied the lead vehicles. He recognized the insignia of the 3rd Panzer Division and the characteristic arrangements of their Panzer IV H models, long-barreled, reliable, deadly at range. He saw mortar half-tracks nestled between them. their crews preparing tubes for rapid fire. He saw the dark, unmistakable outline of a Tiger tank at the center, its turret swiveling slowly as if sniffing the air for prey. Even from this distance, the optics in its heavy mantlet glinted with a precision that made his blood run colder. The Tiger could destroy any Soviet tank at over a kilometer. Its armor shrugged off most Soviet shells. Its 88mm KWK 36 gun was a terror whispered in every trench from Orel to Belgorod. Yet standing on this ridge, Kurolkov was not thinking of the Tiger's gun or its armor. He was thinking of the orders issued at 3:10 that morning. Orders delivered over a crackling field telephone, spoken in a voice hoarse from exhaustion, yet unwavering in purpose. The 9th Guards Rifle Division would hold the line at Bolshoi Mayatsky at all costs. They were the last fully intact Soviet infantry division in this sector, and behind them, further east, stretched the supply routes feeding the 1st Tank Army's counteroffensive. If the Germans broke through here, they would not simply capture a village. They would create a gap wide enough to pour armor deep into the Soviet rear, sever communications, disrupt reserves, and destabilize the entire southern wing of the Kursk front. It would be a blow the Soviets could not afford during the final phases of the battle. Kurolkov took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in his chest like a stone. The thunder of German engines grew louder. The ground trembled faintly beneath his boots. Somewhere behind him, a soldier muttered a prayer under his breath, though no one turned to see who it was. The landscape seemed to narrow, shrinking into a corridor of inevitability between the approaching steel and the thin line of men who waited for it. Above them, the sky brightened, the first true rays of dawn piercing the haze. This was the moment historians would later describe simply as the renewed German push on the southern sector. But for the men on the ridge, it was not a push. It was an avalanche, a wall of metal rolling forward with the unstoppable certainty of a collapsing mountain. The German commanders behind that armored mass believed the Soviet line would shatter within an hour. They believed they faced a fragmented division, weakened by weeks of attrition, incapable of resisting a decisive strike from a concentrated armored spearhead. They believed their momentum, their firepower, and their operational doctrine would once again carve open the front as they had in 1941 and 1942. They did not expect what waited for them on that ridge. They did not expect the tenacity of soldiers who had buried comrades through the night. They did not expect the discipline of artillery crews who had measured every angle, every range, every likely line of advance. They did not expect the minefields, the hidden anti-tank positions, the interlocking arcs of machine gun fire meticulously woven during moonless nights. They did not expect the willingness of exhausted, starving men to resist armor with nothing more than a satchel charge and a final sprint. They did not expect a division that had been written off on paper to stand firm against the heaviest blow the Germans could muster. The German commanders believed they were advancing into a weakened sector. They believed the Soviets were preparing to fall back. They believed that one more push would break the stalemate that had cost them so dearly. While the Tigers descended from the ridge and the long line of panzers spread out across the field like a metallic tide, one truth stood unseen beneath the surface of the smoking landscape. They were marching into a trap not laid by deception, but by endurance. Not by superior firepower, but by human will. Not by surprise, but by the simple, immovable decision of a battered division that refused to yield even a single meter. Major Kurolkov closed his binoculars, exhaled slowly, and stepped down into the trench just as the first German shells began to shriek overhead. The ridge shuddered. The air turned instantly to dust and flame. And in that moment, the story began of how a single Soviet division, outgunned, outnumbered, and nearly broken, would halt the largest armored push the Germans could mount in the southern sector of the Kursk battle. It began not with triumph, but with the deafening roar of artillery marking the start of the day that would test every man's endurance beyond imagination. It began with a division preparing to stand against the steel storm advancing toward them. And it began with German commanders utterly unaware that the field before them would soon rewrite their assumptions, challenge their doctrine, and fracture their understanding of what the Soviet infantry was capable of enduring. The climax of the battle unfolded not as a single moment, but as a tightening spiral, a gradual compression of force and desperation that pulled every man, every weapon, every meter of ground into its gravity. By early afternoon, the sun hung high and heavy above the field, turning the smoke into silver columns and the shattered earth into a mosaic of charred browns and rust-red soil. Heat shimmered above the metal hulls of burning tanks. The air tasted of oil and cordite. The ridge at Bolshoi Mayatsky no longer resembled a natural formation. It had become a furnace in which iron, soil, and human will fused into a single brutal substance. The German armored assault, once a coordinated spearhead of steel and doctrine, had slowed to a grinding, disjointed struggle. Tanks moved individually rather than as a unified column. Each vehicle fought for its own survival. The Tigers still pressed forward, but their momentum was no longer a surge. It was the slow, heavy thrust of beasts forced to wade through a swamp of wreckage. The German infantry found themselves advancing across terrain so torn by bombardment that each step became uncertain. Craters hid dangers. Smoke hid movement. The field itself began to resist the advance. The Soviet defenders sensed the shift. No trumpet or signal announced it, yet everyone felt it unmistakably, the moment when the attackers' certainty faltered. It began with subtle signs. Shots that once landed with confident regularity now struck wide. Tanks that once advanced boldly now hesitated at ridgelines. Infantry that once moved in tight formations now scattered, unsure of the hidden threats that awaited them. The Germans had pushed deep enough into the defensive zone to trigger the next layer of the Soviet plan. The second line of trenches, dug deeper into the ridge and camouflaged with debris, emerged as the primary line of resistance. Soviet machine gunners, who had conserved their ammunition through the morning, opened fire with sustained bursts that tore through German infantry pinned in shallow depressions. The rhythm of the guns became a harsh, monotone pulse across the field. Each burst cut down scattered shapes moving near disabled panzers. The Germans tried to return fire, but their positions were exposed, their cover unreliable, their momentum compromised. As the infantry engagement intensified, the true axis of the battle turned toward the armor. The Tigers, their thick plates scarred by earlier hits, continued their advance. Their engines roared with a ferocity that seemed almost angry, as though the machines themselves resented the resistance. Their 88mm guns thundered at Soviet strongpoints, altering the shape of the ridge with each blast. The Tigers were the backbone of the German assault, and everyone on both sides understood that as long as they moved, the attack remained alive. The Soviet anti-tank gunners focused on isolating the Tigers. They targeted the Panzer IVs first, knowing the lighter tanks were vulnerable from multiple angles. One by one, the Panzers became victims of the suffocating terrain. A 76mm shell struck the turret ring of a Panzer IV, jamming the rotation mechanism. Another shell hit the rear hull of a different Panzer, igniting the engine compartment. Flames burst outward in a violent rush as the tank became a torch, sending a column of black smoke spiraling upward. The air crackled with burning fuel. But even as the Soviet guns struck accurately, the Tigers continued to advance. Their armor absorbed hits that would have destroyed lesser vehicles. They fired back with devastating precision, disabling one of the ZS-3 guns with a direct strike that obliterated the crew in an instant. The wreckage of the gun lay scattered across the trench like shattered bones. For a moment, the balance teetered. Then the Soviet artillery adjusted. A spotter concealed in a shallow ravine called for a salvo from the rear battery of 122 mm howitzers. The guns, positioned in a cluster of birch trees far behind the ridge, fired in rapid succession, their shells arching high into the sky before descending like hammer blows. The first volley fell short, carving trenches into the earth in front of the Tigers. The second volley landed closer. The third landed directly among the German vehicles. The explosions erupted with such force that even the Tigers trembled under the shock. One shell struck between two Tigers, tearing apart the ground and sending a shower of rocks and metallic debris into the air. Infantry near the impact vanished in the blast, their bodies thrown like rag dolls. Another shell detonated beside a panzer that had been maneuvering to flank the ridge, flipping the vehicle onto its side in a burst of fire and dirt. The field shuddered with each strike. The German forward momentum, already strained, began to fracture. The formation loosened further as tanks swerved to avoid craters, only to expose their flanks to waiting gunners. The German command vehicles attempted to redirect the armor, but the smoke, terrain, and disrupted communications made coordination increasingly impossible. The battlefield began to resemble a labyrinth, each corridor blocked by fire, each path marked by wreckage. Soviet engineers, who had waited in reserves for the crucial moment, now emerged from concealed positions with satchel charges. They crawled through the devastated field, using smoke as cover. Their goal was simple and deadly: disable the immobilized Tigers before they could be repaired or used as stationary firing platforms. One engineer sprinted across open ground, weaving through shell impacts, carrying a 40-kilogram charge pressed against his chest. He reached the rear of a Tiger that had lost its right track, placed the charge under the engine compartment, and turned to run. He was struck by shrapnel before he had taken 3 steps. The explosion consumed the Tiger moments later. A second engineer reached another immobilized Tiger, his uniform torn and smeared with mud and blood. He shoved the charge beneath the turret, ignited the fuse, and tried to crawl away. The blast shook the ground as the entire turret lifted from the hull in a geyser of smoke and molten metal. Shrapnel rained in every direction. Yet even with these losses, several Tigers remained operational. Their guns continued to pound the ridge, carving new scars into the land. The German infantry, though battered, continued to follow behind them, seeking any opportunity to breach the Soviet trenches. The Soviets responded with grenades, bayonets, and rifles fired at point-blank range from the shadows of shattered dugouts. The fighting reached a level of brutality that stripped the battlefield of any remaining sense of structure. The climax approached through accumulation. Every second, every meter, every decision added pressure to a point that would either burst the Soviet line or break the German assault entirely. And then, as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, the Germans reached the final line of advance they believed would turn the tide. A shallow ridge lay ahead, lower than the main defensive position, but vital. Beyond it lay the second trench line and the reserves the Soviets had held back until now. If the Germans could crest this ridge with even a handful of operational Tigers, they might still force a collapse. One Tiger, positioned at the center of the formation, surged forward. Its engine bellowed as it climbed the slope. The tank's massive weight crushed the soil beneath it, its tracks biting into the ground with relentless force. Behind it, a second Tiger followed, its turret scanning for threats. A third Panzer IV, damaged but still mobile, attempted to flank slightly to the right. The Soviets saw the movement and recognized the danger immediately. Everything converged on this moment. Artillery officers screamed into field telephones to adjust fire. Anti-tank gunners realigned their barrels. Infantrymen fixed bayonets and prepared for the inevitable breach. Field engineers gathered their remaining charges. The air thickened with anticipation and dread. The first Soviet shells fell just behind the lead Tiger, cutting off the German infantry attempting to follow. The tank reached the crest alone. For a moment, it seemed invincible, a silhouette of power against the smoky backdrop of the sky. The turret turned, its gun lowering to target the Soviet trenches below. Then the ridge erupted beneath it. The Soviets had buried a cluster of anti-tank mines in that exact spot. The combined force of multiple explosions tore through the Tiger's belly armor. The blast lifted the tank off the ground, its hull twisting violently as fire burst from its underside. The tank slammed back down, smoke pouring from its hatches, its engine roaring in protest before dying abruptly. The second Tiger attempted to maneuver around the burning wreck, but hit a patch of churned earth that concealed another mine. Its left track disintegrated. The tank lurched sideways and became stuck, its turret still operational, but its mobility gone. A Soviet gun crew seized the opportunity, firing a volley that hammered the flank repeatedly, each impact weakening the armor. The final shot penetrated the turret ring, igniting ammunition stored inside. The turret froze at a grotesque angle, smoke leaking from the seams. The third tank, the damaged Panzer IV, attempted to retreat, reversing in panic as Soviet artillery intensified. It only managed a few meters before a shell landed directly in front of it, flipping the vehicle onto its rear in a plume of dust. With the armored spear tip shattered, the German infantry lost their protective shield. Soviet machine guns and mortars opened fire with renewed ferocity. The Germans were pinned in the open, unable to advance or retreat. Their officers attempted to rally them, but the battlefield had turned against them decisively. The final collapse of the German assault came not with a dramatic act, but with a gradual ebbing of fire. The remaining tanks, outnumbered, isolated, or immobilized, could not push forward. The infantry no longer had coordinated direction. Artillery support began to falter as ammunition ran low and Soviet counter-battery fire intensified. One by one, the remaining German elements withdrew or fell silent. The climax was not a victory announced with cheers or triumph. It was a quiet, exhausted realization among the Soviet defenders that the largest armored push the Germans could muster in this sector had been stopped, not by superior firepower, not by overwhelming force, but by endurance, preparation, and the unyielding will of a division that refused to break. The ridge at Bolshoi Mayatsky remained in Soviet hands. The German assault had shattered upon it like a wave meeting a granite cliff. When the sun finally dipped behind the broken horizon, the ridge at Bolshoi Mayatsky lay wrapped in the kind of silence that follows only after the exhaustion of great violence. The smoke still drifted in long, torn ribbons above the battlefield, its color shifting from black to deep blue as the evening shadows overtook the field. Fires burned in isolated pockets, flickering beneath the twisted hulks of tanks and the shattered remnants of vehicles that just hours earlier had carried the confidence of an entire armored assault. The light faded slowly, revealing the wreckage not as a scene of warfare in motion, but as a frozen landscape where the intensity of the day had solidified into an unchanging tableau. The Soviet defenders emerged from their trenches with heavy, deliberate steps, each man moving as though gravity had grown stronger. They carried the fatigue of a full day's struggle in every motion. Some limped, some leaned on rifles like walking sticks. Others collapsed the moment their duty allowed. The battlefield did not allow rest, but the moment demanded understanding. The men surveyed the terrain around them, realizing the scale of what had occurred. The charred remains of Tigers, vehicles once regarded as invincible, lay scattered across the ravaged earth. Panzer IVs smoldered in shallow craters. Burned-out half-tracks sat frozen in positions that suggested their crews had fought until the final moment. The German infantry, who had advanced so assertively in the morning, now lay silent in the depressions and trenches where they had sought shelter. The Soviets moved quietly among their positions, checking weapons, helping wounded comrades out of the craters, and clearing debris from communication trenches that had been nearly filled during the bombardments. The stretcher bearers appeared as they always did after a major fight, their faces blank with the heavy neutrality required to endure their grim task. They lifted wounded men with practiced strength, carrying them to makeshift medical posts established behind the ridge. From there, the low moans of pain blended into the quiet air, a reminder that survival carried a cost of its own. As the last light faded, field medics worked under lanterns whose dim glow illuminated blood-streaked hands and torn uniforms. They cut away clothing, applied bandages, set broken bones, and made decisions that meant life or death with a kind of calm that could only come from necessity. The surgeons in the rear worked in tents that smelled of disinfectant and damp earth, their instruments clinking softly as they moved from one fractured body to the next. Outside, the wounded waited their turn on stretchers lined along the shallow slopes. Their eyes reflected the lantern light, carrying the layered stories of shock, endurance, and the unstoppable forward motion of war. The German forces, no longer capable of sustaining their assault, withdrew across the fields they had once crossed with such confidence. Their retreat was not chaotic, but it was somber. They left disabled machines behind. They abandoned positions that could not be held. Their command posts reported losses that exceeded expectations by every measure. What had been imagined as a decisive push had collapsed into a costly failure. Reports reaching their headquarters carried a tone of disbelief. The Soviet division they had assumed near collapse had not only held, but inflicted damage severe enough to blunt the largest concentration of armor they could assemble in this sector. For the Germans, the outcome at Bolshoi Mayatsky echoed beyond the local battlefield. It signaled the diminishing capacity of their armored divisions to deliver breakthroughs. It signaled the beginning of the end for offensive operations on the Eastern Front. It signaled that the Battle of Kursk, once envisioned as their opportunity to regain the initiative, had instead cemented the strategic momentum of the Red Army. The failure of this push was not merely a tactical setback. It reflected a deeper shift. The attrition of experience, the loss of material, the diminishing influence of doctrine that had once carved through continents. As night deepened and the stars emerged slowly above the smoke-veiled sky, the Soviet defenders began rebuilding their positions, reinforcing trenches, resetting machine gun emplacements, and preparing for the possibility of renewed attacks. Experience told them that nothing was permanent on the battlefield. A victory could be followed by another assault. A quiet hour could be the prelude to renewed bombardment. Yet something felt different now. The defenders sensed a shift, not only in the battle, but in the war itself. They had endured one of the heaviest armored strikes the Germans could muster, and the line had not broken. The weight of that realization settled into the trenches like a quiet truth. Far behind the ridge, Soviet command posts received reports throughout the night. The casualty lists were long. The ammunition expenditure was enormous. Entire platoons had been reduced to a handful of survivors. Anti-tank positions had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the course of the day. Yet when the reports reached the division headquarters, they carried a clarity that outshone the losses. The German armored attack had failed. The line had held. The division, though battered, remained cohesive. The importance of this moment echoed outward in ways the soldiers on the ridge could not fully grasp. The battle at Bolshoi Mayatsky was one component of a larger struggle, but its consequences rippled across the southern face of the Kursk front. German armored reserves had been drained. Their ability to project offensive force in this region was crippled. Their commanders had committed their strongest remaining armor, only to see it consumed by a division they had underestimated. The failure revealed the truth that had been building since Stalingrad. Germany's capacity for decisive offensive action was eroding. while the Red Army's ability to withstand and counter powerful blows was strengthening with each passing month. As midnight approached, the battlefield cooled. The fires burned lower. The smoke thinned. The moon emerged from behind a curtain of drifting clouds, casting pale silver light across the ruined landscape. The forms of destroyed tanks cast long shadows, stretching across the fields like monuments of defeat. The silence grew deeper, broken only by the distant thump of artillery on far sectors of the front or the low rumble of supply trucks bringing ammunition to the trenches. The Soviet soldiers, finally given a moment to rest, sat along the slopes of the ridge, their backs pressed against the earth they had defended with their lives. Some closed their eyes and drifted into shallow, uneasy sleep. Others stared into the darkness, their minds replaying the day's events with the slow, heavy rhythm of exhaustion. They thought of comrades lost, of moments when death had seemed certain, of the strange mixture of fear and resolve that had guided their actions. They breathed slowly, aware that they had crossed a threshold few could articulate. They had faced the full force of the German armored corps and endured. For the officers of the division, the night brought reflection of a different kind. They examined hand-drawn maps marked with destroyed positions and reorganized their companies based on who was left. They penned terse reports that summarized the day's events with clinical precision while carrying the emotional weight of the sacrifice beneath the surface. They knew the division would be expected to fight again soon. They knew reinforcements would take time to arrive. They knew the coming days would bring new challenges. Yet they also knew that what had happened on this ridge would strengthen the Soviet strategic posture across the entire southern front. As the final hours of the night passed and the first hints of dawn touched the sky once more, the ridge stood quietly. The battlefield bore scars that would remain long after the war ended. The soil had been altered by fire and metal. The trees lay shredded. The trenches meandered across the landscape like the exposed veins of a wounded creature. And yet, beneath all this destruction, something new had taken shape. The myth of German invincibility, once a defining feature of the war's early years, had lost another piece of itself. The idea that Soviet infantry could not stand against concentrated armored assault had been disproven in the most brutal and undeniable manner. As the new day emerged, distant columns of dust hinted at Soviet reinforcements arriving to relieve the battered division. Trucks carrying ammunition rolled toward the ridge. Engineers prepared to salvage what equipment they could. Field kitchens lit small fires to prepare thin soups for the exhausted men. The work of rebuilding began, a process that would continue long after the memories of the day's battle dimmed. The German commanders who had authorized the assault studied their maps in frustration, calculating how much armor remained, how many tanks could be salvaged, and how long it would take to reorganize their depleted formations. They traced the contours of the ridge at Bolshoi Mayachki with fingers that betrayed their disappointment. They understood the significance of the failure. They understood that the opportunity to regain the initiative had slipped away. They understood that their armored power, once the cutting edge of their doctrine, had been blunted beyond easy repair. The ridge itself became a quiet witness to the transformation. It had seen the tide of steel advance with confidence. It had heard the thunder of cannons and felt the weight of explosions that tore open the earth. It had absorbed the final seconds of men on both sides. And when the steel tide broke, the ridge still stood, scarred, altered, but unyielding. The story of how a single Soviet division stopped the largest armored push the Germans could muster in this sector of the Kursk battle did not end in triumphal celebration. It ended in a tired dawn, in quiet endurance, in the steady realization that the war had shifted. It ended with men who understood that victory was not measured in the destruction of an enemy, but in the survival of a line that was never meant to break. It ended with a ridge that would soon fade into the endless succession of battles, yet would remain a turning point concealed within the vast mosaic of the Eastern Front. And as the sun rose once more over the smoking fields, the legacy of the day settled into the cold soil of Bolshoi Mayatsky, a reminder that resilience, when carried by those with no choice but to endure, can halt even the heaviest thrust of steel, and that history often turns not on sweeping maneuvers, but on moments where exhausted men decide, with nothing left but will, to stand their ground.